The Kansas wind, dry and relentless, scoured the small settlement of Elk Creek, carrying more than just dust. It carried whispers. Whispers about the fertile land claims, and more recently, whispers about the men who had vanished trying to settle them. It was the autumn of 1871, a time when the West was still wild, but not by nature, by human design. Elias Thorne, a surveyor from Missouri with a grim determination and a weathered map, rode into Elk Creek on a Tuesday. The settlement was barely a cluster of shacks, a general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith. It was meant to be the gateway to prosperity, yet an unsettling stillness hung in the air, a silence too deep for a town founded on ambition. Elias didn't seek gold. He sought his brother Silas, who had come ahead 6 weeks prior to file a claim on a prime tract of prairie land, and had stopped sending letters 3 weeks ago. The saloon, aptly named the Dry Well, was Elias's first stop. It was dark, smelled of stale beer and desperation, and was inhabited by a few grizzled figures who barely lifted their heads as he entered. Behind the counter, a gaunt man with a tired face wiped the same spot on the wooden bar. "I'm looking for a man named Silas Thorne," Elias said, his voice cutting through the gloom. Tall, scar above his left eye, claims land near the river. The bartender paused, his rag motionless. "A lot of men come through here looking for land, mister. Not all of them stay. Silas always writes." He stopped. "I need to know who saw him last." One of the men in the corner, a trapper with a tangled beard, coughed. He was around, bragged about his claim, said he was building a cabin near the O'Connell sisters' property. The name struck Elias as odd. Sisters. Are they settlers? The bartender frowned. "They're what you call established. Been here longer than the rest of us. Own a large spread north of the river. Isolated. Good land, but they keep to themselves." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Silas went out there. He stopped coming back to town to buy supplies about 3 weeks back. Same time you stopped hearing from him." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The absence of a letter was now an absence of presence. Did he have any trouble with them? A dispute over a boundary? "Nobody disputes with the O'Connells," the bartender said flatly, avoiding Elias's eyes. "They got a reputation. Quiet, private, and they seem to attract bad luck for anyone who settles too close." That night, Elias took a room at the boarding house, a rickety structure where the floorboards groaned under the weight of ghosts and tired men. He spread Silas's last letter on the table. It spoke of the excellent soil, the pending cabin, and a passing mention of the O'Connell property. Silas had written, "Odd setup. 2 sisters running a large ranch alone. They keep to themselves, but their land is prime. They seem unsettled that my claim borders theirs, but I told them my papers are clean. Nothing to worry about, I suppose. Just strange." The next morning, armed with his brother's map, Elias rode north. The prairie was endless, a sea of brown grass under a vast, indifferent sky. After an hour of riding, he found the boundary marker Silas had described, a crude pile of stones. Just beyond it, the land changed. It was unnaturally well kept, the grass neatly trimmed, the fences solid and new. The O'Connell property. The ranch house was a solid, imposing structure. Unlike the flimsy shacks of Elk Creek, it looked less like a home and more like a fortress. As Elias approached, 2 figures emerged from the barn. They were indeed women, but far from frail. One, Agnes, was taller and broader, with a face that looked carved from stone, her eyes sharp and assessing. The other, Ruth, was slightly smaller, quieter, her features softer, but with a vacant quality in her gaze that was unsettling. Both were dressed in practical, heavy work clothes. Elias dismounted, pulling the fear down and letting only polite firmness show. "Ladies, my name is Elias Thorne. I'm looking for my brother Silas." Agnes O'Connell stepped forward, wiping her hands on a denim apron. Her voice was low and gravelly. "Silas Thorne. Yes, he came through a few times." "When was the last time you saw him?" Agnes looked towards the distant boundary line. 3 weeks ago, maybe. He was working his claim. Said he had to ride to the next town for some better lumber. Haven't seen him since. He wouldn't leave his claim. Not after all that work, Elias countered. Did he mention any disputes? Any local trouble? Ruth spoke then, her voice a thin, reedy sound that startled Elias. He was a loud man, too loud for the prairie. Claimed he found something on his land. A spring. He was boastful. She didn't look at Elias. Her gaze was fixed on the ground. A spring, Elias repeated, grasping at the detail. A natural spring would make Silas's claim 10 times more valuable and a target. What exactly did he say about it? Agnes cut in smoothly, pulling the focus back. He just made noise, Mr. Thorne. Claimed his spring was on our side of the original deed. We corrected him, told him he was mistaken. He left it at that. Her eyes held a chilling lack of emotion. He packed up and left to buy lumber. That's all we know. Elias's gut screamed they were lying, their coordinated responses, the quick deflection, the subtle shift in focus. It was too clean. He looked past them, toward the back of the property. Near the well and the vegetable garden, the soil looked recently disturbed. Too much for a simple garden bed. If you don't mind, Elias said, pointing to the disturbed earth, I'd like to have a look around his claim, just to see if he left any sign. Agnes's eyes narrowed, a flash of something possessive and cold. You're welcome to it, Mr. Thorne, but this is our property. We don't appreciate strangers poking around our farm. She didn't warn him with a gun or a threat. She warned him with the sheer weight of her presence, the absolute certainty of her domain. Elias tipped his hat, a cold dread replacing his initial anxiety. He had found the last people to see Silas. He had also found the first suspects. He rode a few hundred yards back to his brother's empty claim. The site was abandoned, tools left out, wood half-stacked, a small, deep hole where Silas had intended to sink a well. Elias stood in the silence, listening to the wind and the pounding of his own heart. Silas had not left. Something, or someone, had stopped him, and it all pointed back to the secluded farm and the quiet, unnerving competence of the O'Connell sisters. The mystery was no longer about a missing letter. It was about a missing body. Elias's arrival had disturbed the stillness, but now he was caught in the chilling silence of their secret. Before you move on to the next chapter, if you are enjoying this dive into the realism and suspense of the Old West, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us uncover more chilling, authentic human histories like this one. Don't miss the next part of Elias's search. Elias spent the rest of that afternoon at his brother's claim, but the silence was the loudest evidence. Silas's tools, a shovel, a rusted pickaxe, and a half-full bag of nails were scattered haphazardly, not deliberately packed. A man planning a long trip for lumber wouldn't leave his essential equipment exposed to the elements. He'd secure it, or at the very least, take the wagon. But the wagon tracks leading away from the claim were sparse, suggesting Silas had ridden out on horseback, possibly for a brief supply run, not a 6-week disappearance. The crucial detail, however, was the well site. Silas had begun digging, but the hole was shallow, barely 3 feet deep. Yet, lying beside it was a coil of unused rope and a freshly sharpened auger, tools for deep drilling. This contradicted the O'Connell's statement that Silas had been boastful about finding a spring. If he had found water, he would have been frantically working to secure it, not packing up to leave. Elias knelt, scraping away the loose dirt. The soil felt dry, unremarkable. The only thing of note was a single small, smooth piece of river rock, foreign to the prairie soil, embedded near the edge of the pit. Elias pocketed it, an insignificant clue that felt monumentally important in the suffocating emptiness. He rode back toward Elk Creek as the sun dipped, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and blood red. He stopped at the boundary line, watching the O'Connell ranch. In the twilight, the place was deeply isolated, cut off not just by distance but by an air of deliberate exclusion. He noticed a faint column of smoke rising not from the main house, but from a small detached stone building near the barn. Perhaps a smokehouse or a forge. Back at the dry well, Elias sought out the bartender, finding him scrubbing the bar with unusual ferocity. "Tell me everything you know about the O'Connell sisters," Elias demanded, pushing a handful of silver onto the counter. The bartender hesitated, his eyes darting to the few patrons. "They're Agnes and Ruth. Came here about 5 years back. Bought up a failing ranch. Worked it themselves. Hard women. They don't hire hands. Never seen a ranch so well run by 2 women. Did they have trouble with other settlers? Disputes? Always. They claim their property lines are shifting. A few men who settled nearby, Tom Higgins, Jedediah Shaw, a German immigrant named Hans, they all had prime riverfront claims that bordered the O'Connells. All of them left." Elias leaned closer. "Left? Or disappeared?" The bartender wiped his brow, the movement betraying his nervousness. "No one ever found a body, Mr. Thorne. They just packed up and were gone, or so people said. Higgins's wagon was found miles away, abandoned, but he was gone. Shaw just vanished from his shack overnight. The official word was they gave up on the harsh life and moved on. But those claims, the O'Connells filed new deeds on every single one, citing abandonment. Their ranch doubled in size in 3 years." Elias stared at the man, the pieces clicking into a terrifying pattern. Silas hadn't been an anomaly. He was a tally mark. "Where are the deeds filed? Which county seat?" "Wichita, a long ride. But the notary who signed the last 3 transfers, his name is Mr. Alistair. He lives right here in Elk Creek. Has a small office next to the general store." Before leaving the saloon, Elias made one more observation. The trapper who had mentioned the sisters earlier was now gone. No one else seemed willing to meet Elias's gaze or discuss the O'Connells. The silence in the saloon was not one of peace, but of cowardice and complicity. Elias sought out Mr. Alistair's office. Alistair was a nervous, portly man, smelling faintly of ink and cheap whiskey. He was shuffling papers when Elias entered. "Mr. Alistair, I'm Elias Thorne. My brother Silas is missing. His land borders the O'Connell property. I understand you handled the transfer of several claims they've acquired recently." Alistair's hands began to tremble. "Land transfers are public record, Mr. Thorne. I simply processed the legal documents. 3 men, Higgins, Shaw, and Hans, all vanished, and the sisters now own their land. My brother is now missing. Do you see a pattern, Mr. Alistair, or do I need to explain it to the sheriff in Wichita?" Elias pressed, his voice hard. Alistair visibly wilted. They presented the abandonment papers, Mr. Thorne. Signed, witnessed, perfectly legal. Who witnessed them? Agnes O'Connell always had a signature from a Mr. Wallace, said he was a hired hand or a surveyor who saw the settlers pack up and leave. "Mr. Wallace, have you ever met this man?" Alistair wrung his hands. "No. The sisters. They bring the documents in already completed. I just stamped them. They pay very well. In gold." The desperation in his voice confirmed his guilt in the transactional cover-up. He was a small player, but a critical link in the chain of theft and disappearance. Elias left the notary, the truth solidifying into a terrifying certainty. The O'Connells were not just land-hungry, they were systematic predators. Their method was simple: isolate, remove, and legally seize. But the fact that no bodies were ever found was the key, and the greatest source of psychological terror. They were meticulous. He needed a closer look at their ranch, and he needed a plan that didn't involve confronting 2 women who were already suspected of 4 murders. The stone building near the barn, the one with the smoke, still haunted him. It wasn't a forge. A forge would have a chimney. This building had a low, thin vent near the roof line, designed to minimize visibility of the smoke. It was the perfect place for a hidden operation. That night, Elias prepared. He purchased a dark wool coat, a better rifle, and secured his horse outside of town. He also borrowed a pair of wire cutters from the blacksmith, citing a need to repair a distant fence. Under the cold, moonless expanse of the Kansas night, Elias rode back to the O'Connell ranch. The silence was heavier than before, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft thud of his horse's hooves. He skirted the main house, staying low in the tall prairie grass until he reached the fence line near the stone outbuilding. The O'Connells were asleep, their windows dark, the fortress quiet. Elias cut the wire, slipped through and crept toward the stone structure. As he approached, he noticed a subtle, metallic smell in the air, masked by the natural scents of the farm and the prairie wind. It was faint, but undeniably acrid, like burnt chemical residue. He reached the heavy wooden door. It was secured by a thick metal latch and a large, newly fitted padlock. The sisters were clearly protecting whatever was inside. He knelt, pressing his ear to the cold stone. No sound. He tested the door, which didn't budge. He then moved to the low vent near the roof. Carefully, Elias stood on an upturned feed bucket he found nearby and peered into the darkness of the vent opening. He couldn't see much, only the floor directly below the vent. But what he saw sent a paralyzing shockwave through him. It wasn't a smokehouse or a forge. It was a concrete floor, unlike the dirt floors of the other outbuildings. And on that concrete, bathed in the faint moonlight filtering through the vent, was a single long dark stain. A stain that looked too large to be oil, too dark to be dirt, and too significant to ignore. It was evidence of something heavy, something violent, and something that had been meticulously, but not perfectly, cleaned. Elias scrambled down, his breath ragged. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The stone building wasn't a workshop, it was a slaughterhouse. And the victims weren't cattle. He had to get away, get to Wichita, and bring back a federal marshal. But as he turned to retreat, a light flickered in the main ranch house window. Someone was awake. And worse, a large dark shadow detached itself from the side of the house and began moving, slowly and deliberately, toward the stone building, toward the fence line, toward Elias Thorne. The figure moving toward the outbuilding was Agnes O'Connell. She carried no lamp, navigating the darkness with an uncanny familiarity that suggested nightly patrols. Elias froze, sinking low into the deep shadow cast by the water trough near the fence. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Agnes paused just feet from the stone structure, pulling a heavy key from her pocket. The metallic clank of the lock being opened echoed in the profound silence. She stepped inside, and the door closed immediately, plunging the area back into darkness. This gave Elias a small window of opportunity, but it was agonizingly brief. He had to leave now. But curiosity, mixed with the desperate urgency of a brother's love, kept him rooted. Agnes was likely moving evidence or checking her gruesome workspace. He crept along the fence line, making his way back to the cut wire. As he was about to slip through, he heard a new sound, a faint, rhythmic thudding coming from inside the stone building. It wasn't a hammer. It sounded muffled, heavier, like something being moved or broken apart on a heavy floor. Elias remembered the concrete floor and the dark stain. He imagined Agnes working with the grim efficiency of a butcher. He made it through the fence and scrambled onto his horse, keeping a tight rein on the animal to prevent it from neighing. He rode hard and fast, back towards Elk Creek, the mental image of the dark stain and the sound of the muffled thudding burning into his mind. Back in town, the first rays of dawn were painting the sky. Elias found the blacksmith, Old Man Hemlock, already stoking his forge. Hemlock was a quiet, sturdy man who had clearly seen the harsh realities of the frontier. Elias paid him extra for his silence and a promise of help. "I need to know about that stone building on the O'Connell place," Elias stated, his voice tight. "The small one, near the barn." Hemlock paused, wiping soot from his forehead. "That used to be a rendering shed, Mr. Thorne. Back when the place was a proper ranch 5 years ago, they'd boil down the scraps, fats, bones, for soap and tallow. Is it still being used for that?" Hemlock shrugged. "Don't know. Never smelled it. Agnes and Ruth, they're odd. They built a heavy new door for it themselves, asked me to make that latch, said they didn't want varmints getting in to spoil the tallow." The acid, metallic smell Elias had detected, the concrete floor, The stain, the muffled sounds, it all pointed toward a horrifying industrial process, not just a simple burial. Rendering, boiling, destruction, the systematic elimination of a body, leaving nothing but ash and liquid residue. This was why no bodies were ever found. They weren't buried, they were destroyed. Elias left the blacksmith and went directly to Mr. Alistair's office. The notary, still jumpy, was now terrified. Elias didn't waste time on threats. He used the truth. "Mr. Alistair, I was at the O'Connell ranch last night. They have a building they use to destroy evidence. My brother is dead. The other men are dead. They're stealing the land after they eliminate the claimant. You helped them by falsifying the abandonment papers." Alistair broke. "I didn't know they were killing, I swear. I just thought they were intimidating them, buying them out cheaply," he stammered, pulling out a hidden ledger from his desk. "But the papers, the witnesses, it was all a lie. Agnes paid me 5 times the normal fee in gold dust every time. The witness, Mr. Wallace. Who is he? No one. It was her signature. I suspect she signs for the victims too. She needs an official, legal-looking chain of custody for the land to prove they willingly sold or left." Elias realized the true scale of the O'Connell's operation. It was a chillingly effective legal loophole combined with murder. They were stealing land by eliminating the owner and then producing fake, witnessed papers of abandonment or sale, with Alistair's official stamp, making it all look legitimate. "I need you to testify. To a federal marshal. I'm riding to Wichita today." Alistair paled further. "If I testify, they'll know I betrayed them. They'll kill me, Mr. Thorne. They are ruthless. They have the whole town too scared to speak. You're already complicit in 4 murders and a vast land fraud. You'll either face the hangman or the O'Connells. The marshal offers protection. Your choice." Elias gave the man no comfort, only 2 terrible options. Alistair, defeated, agreed to write a sworn deposition detailing his role in the land fraud, which Elias would take to the authorities. As Elias was preparing to leave Elk Creek, he ran into Ruth O'Connell at the general store. She was buying sacks of lye and large quantities of coal, supplies that fit the rendering process perfectly. She saw Elias, but instead of the usual passive quiet, her eyes were sharp, calculating. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice calm, a slight chilling smile playing on her lips. "I thought you were going to search for your brother." "I have enough to start my search elsewhere," Elias replied evenly, meeting her stare. "Your neighbors have been very helpful filling in the gaps about the other men who left their land." Ruth's smile didn't waver, but her eyes held a spark of genuine malice. "People in the West talk a lot, Mr. Thorne. Most of it is tall tales and bad whiskey. But sometimes people who talk too much find themselves traveling." Elias felt the direct, psychological threat like a physical blow. He was the next one on their list, and they knew he was onto them. He rode out of Elk Creek fast, holding Alistair's sworn, sealed confession close to his chest. However, the plains offered no sanctuary. After an hour of hard riding, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The rapid, deliberate gallop of a pursuing horse. He didn't have to look back to know who it was. The sisters hadn't waited for him to reach Wichita. They were coming for him now, to ensure his voice and Alistair's confession were silenced forever. They were methodical, they were swift, and they were closing the gap. Elias spurred his horse into a desperate gallop. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The silhouette of a single rider, low to the saddle, was visible against the flat horizon, gaining speed with unnerving efficiency. It was a fast horse and a determined rider, almost certainly Agnes O'Connell, the bolder and more physically imposing of the two. He needed to get off the open prairie. The confession in his pocket, signed and sealed by Alistair, was his lifeline. But it was also a death sentence if he couldn't deliver it. Elias saw a small, rugged outcrop of low hills and scrub brush about a mile ahead, a place that offered cover and an opportunity to turn the tables. He pushed his horse harder, the lather forming white foam on its neck. The gap narrowed. Agnes was a skilled rider and likely armed with a rifle. Elias realized his life depended on the terrain, not pure speed. He reached the cover of the hills and immediately dismounted, pulling his rifle. He led his horse into a small rocky draw, tethering it out of sight. He scrambled up a low ridge, settling behind a cluster of boulders just as Agnes's horse crested the rise, less than a quarter-mile away. Agnes didn't slow down. She was riding with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, certain of her quarry. Elias sighted his rifle. He could take the shot, but the goal wasn't to kill her, it was to escape and expose them. He needed to disable her pursuit without becoming a murderer himself. Instead of firing at Agnes, Elias aimed at the horse's foreleg. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed, followed instantly by a terrifying, high-pitched scream. Agnes's horse buckled, collapsing in a tangle of limbs and dust. Agnes was thrown clear, landing hard and rolling in the dirt. Elias saw his chance and immediately ran back to his own horse. He heard a furious, raw shout from the distance. Agnes, injured, but very much alive. He mounted up and rode further into the rough hills, zigzagging to break her line of sight. He managed to ride for another hour before slowing down, his nerves frayed, his horse exhausted. He was alone, but the encounter had shaken him profoundly. The cold, calculated intent in Agnes's pursuit was terrifying. They were professionals. Elias stopped by a dry creek bed to give his horse water and rest. He examined the confession, Alistair's shaky, ink-stained signature, detailing the illegal land transfers, the fake Mr. Wallace witness, and the gold payments. It was enough for a warrant. But as he sat, catching his breath, he noticed something in the dry soil near the creek bed. A subtle, almost imperceptible line that ran parallel to the creek. It was a drag mark. A heavy object had been pulled along the creek bed sometime recently. He followed the faint indentation for 50 yards. It led, not to water, but to a small, hidden cave entrance, barely covered by a tumble of loose rock and mesquite brush. The air around the opening smelled faintly of something chemical, metallic, and vaguely earthy, a smell that immediately reminded him of the O'Connell outbuilding. His heart thudding again, Elias pushed aside the covering brush and squeezed into the narrow opening. The cave was small and pitch black. He struck a match. The flickering light revealed a cramped man-made storage area. There were stacks of empty crates, old tools, and several large sealed barrels. The barrels were the problem. They were industrial grade, far too heavy and clean for a simple ranch cache. He examined the nearest one. It was labeled in faded painted letters, lye, industrial grade. He remembered Ruth purchasing large quantities of lye in Elk Creek. Lye was caustic, used in soap making, but also a crucial chemical component in rendering animal matter down to bone and liquid. The cave was a covert storage and disposal site, likely used as an auxiliary to the rendering shed back at the ranch, a place to hide the materials used for the horrific process, or even a place to hide the resulting waste. The drag mark suggested the barrels had been moved recently. As the match burned down, Elias scanned the cave floor again. In the far corner, tucked beneath a pile of canvas, he saw something glinting. He reached out and pulled the canvas away. It wasn't a body. It wasn't bone. It was a neat pile of personal effects. 3 leather wallets, a pocket watch, and a small silver crucifix. He opened the first wallet. The photograph inside was faded but clear. A burly man with a thick beard, Tom Higgins. He opened the second. A passport-like document with a name scrawled in German, Hans. The third wallet was newer, the leather less worn. Inside there was a small ink-drawn portrait of a woman and 2 young children, and beside the portrait, a single water-stained piece of paper. It was a land deed for a prime riverfront property, and the name scrawled at the top was Silas Thorne. Elias didn't need to open the pocket watch or the crucifix. The wallets were the devastating proof. The O'Connells had executed Higgins, Hans, and his own brother Silas, stripped them of the possessions they used to confirm their identity, and then systematically dissolved their bodies. The personal effects were kept as a grotesque collection. proof of their conquests and a tool to fake the abandonment signatures. Silas's deed was likely waiting to be illegally stamped by Alistair as transferred. The psychological impact of this discovery was immense. The sisters hadn't just murdered men for land. They had utterly erased them, a cold, calculated act of annihilation that spoke to a profound, clinical evil. Elias gathered the wallets, the watch, and the deed, wrapping them tightly in the canvas. This evidence, combined with Alistair's confession, was unassailable. He felt a fierce, renewed purpose. He was no longer just a brother searching for a missing man. He was an investigator closing in on a pair of serial killers. He mounted his horse and turned south, riding with a renewed sense of urgency toward Wichita, the county seat. The sun was high now, beating down on the empty prairie. He had survived the immediate pursuit, but he knew the O'Connells would not stop. They were likely already back in Elk Creek, plotting their next move, possibly targeting Alistair to destroy the evidence trail. Elias had to get to Wichita before the sisters could tie up all their loose ends. He was carrying the proof of their terrible enterprise, and he knew that somewhere, probably miles back, Agnes O'Connell was tending to her injured horse, her fury building, preparing to resume the hunt. He had delayed her, but he had not defeated her. The race against time, and against two cold-blooded killers, had truly begun. Elias rode for 16 straight hours, pushing his horse to its limit. The journey to Wichita, though manageable in normal circumstances, became a gauntlet under the constant threat of pursuit. He avoided the main roads, sticking to the hidden trails and dry riverbeds, utilizing the navigational skills he and Silas had learned surveying. The heavy canvas bundle containing the wallets and Silas's deed was strapped securely to his chest, the physical weight of the evidence mirroring the psychological weight of his mission. He hadn't seen any sign of Agnes, but the paranoia was a constant companion. Every sound, a distant coyote's howl, the rush of the wind through the tall grass, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He knew the sisters were methodical. They would have a plan B, and that plan likely included eliminating Mr. Alistair, the weakest link in their chain. Just before dawn, exhausted and saddle-sore, Elias reached the outskirts of Wichita. The town was a sprawling, bustling settlement, a stark contrast to the desolate silence of Elk Creek. The noise of commerce, the smell of fresh bread, and the sight of actual law enforcement, a few uniformed deputies patrolling the street, was a profound relief. Elias's first stop was the federal marshal's office. The marshal, a stern, methodical man named Hansen, was skeptical at first, used to dealing with claims of cattle rustling and petty frontier disputes, not a complex conspiracy of murder and land fraud orchestrated by two women. "Mr. Thorne, you're claiming two sisters are systematically killing men, dissolving their bodies and using a local notary to steal their land. That's a lurid tale, even for Kansas," Marshal Hansen said, leaning back in his chair, unimpressed. Elias didn't argue. He placed the evidence on the marshal's desk. Alistair's sworn confession, sealed and official, the 3 wallets containing the identifications of Higgins, Hans, and a third man named Shaw, whose papers he'd found tucked in Silas's wallet, and finally, Silas Thorne's land deed. "This is Mr. Alistair's signature," Elias said, tapping the confession. He details how he stamped these deeds as abandoned for gold payments. "This is the deed belonging to my missing brother Silas. And these," he opened the wallets, "belong to the 3 other men who vanished. The sisters kept them as trophies or for signatures. And the bodies? They use a rendering process in a stone building on their property to eliminate all trace." Marshal Hansen's skepticism vanished, replaced by a grim realization. The physical evidence, combined with the notarized confession of a complicit official, was undeniable. The sheer audacity and coldness of the crime elevated it far beyond a simple frontier murder. "This is not a local sheriff matter, Mr. Thorne," Hansen said, now fully engaged. "This is a federal case, serial murder, interstate fraud, and land theft. The implications for settlement and legal ownership across the territory are massive." Hansen immediately dispatched 2 of his most trusted deputies back to Elk Creek, one to secure Mr. Alistair and bring him safely back to Wichita as a key witness, and the other to obtain a warrant from the local judge and then proceed to the O'Connell Ranch to execute the search and arrest. Elias insisted on riding back with the deputy heading to the ranch, but Hansen flatly refused. "You are the key witness, Mr. Thorne, and you've already had a close call. Your job is done. The law takes over now. You will stay here and give a detailed account of everything you saw at the cave and the ranch. We need to be able to build a case that will stand up to the gallows." Reluctantly, Elias agreed. He spent the next several hours in a small, dusty office, dictating his account to a clerk, describing the ominous silence of the ranch, the stone outbuilding, the acidic smell, the dark stain on the floor, and the gruesome collection in the cave. The memory of the muffled, thudding sound from the outbuilding was still sharp, a final, horrifying detail of the sisters' efficient, mechanical cruelty. Meanwhile, back in Elk Creek, the deputy tasked with securing Alistair found the notary's office locked and silent. The deputy hammered on the door, but there was no response. He forced the lock. The office was empty. The floor was spotless, and the ledgers were neatly stacked. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, only a cold, unsettling orderliness. Alistair hadn't fled. He had vanished, leaving behind no note, no sign of his departure or his fate. The deputy was forced to report back to the Marshal Hansen via a fast rider. The news hit the marshal's office like a lead weight. "They got to him," Marshal Hansen muttered grimly, slamming his fist on the desk. The sisters knew he was the only one who could truly expose the legality of their fraud. They cleaned him out just as meticulously as they cleaned their victims. However, Alistair's confession, written and signed before his disappearance, was still secure. It was a solid legal anchor, but the loss of the key witness was a major blow, replacing a concrete testimony with a fresh layer of mystery and fear. The second deputy, having secured the warrant, was already riding with a posse toward the O'Connell Ranch. The urgency was now paramount. The sisters, having silenced Alistair, were likely alerted and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Elias, hearing the news about Alistair, felt a fresh surge of dread. The sisters were always one step ahead. Their cold competence was their greatest weapon. They had neutralized a key threat, confirming their ruthless efficiency. He looked out the window of the marshal's office, the bustling street seeming irrelevant to the dark deeds unfolding on the prairie. The fate of Silas, the terror of the victims, and the future of the Kansas territory rested entirely on that posse, riding toward a homestead that was less a ranch and more a house of horrors. The marshal's posse, consisting of Deputy Stevens and 4 seasoned trackers, rode hard toward the O'Connell Ranch. They moved with caution, knowing they were approaching a scene of potential violence. This wasn't a simple arrest. It was an attempt to apprehend 2 cunning serial killers who operated under the facade of quiet, industrious women. As they approached the property, the scene was unsettlingly normal. The house was closed up. The livestock were quietly grazing, and the only visible sign of activity was the faint smoke rising from the chimney of the main house. The stone outbuilding stood silent and dark, its heavy, locked door a clear target. Deputy Stevens, the leader, instructed his men to circle the house, cutting off any possibility of escape into the vast prairie. He and 1 other deputy, Harkness, approached the front door, guns drawn. Stevens hammered on the heavy oak door. "Agnes O'Connell, Ruth O'Connell, this is the federal marshal's office. We have a warrant for your arrest. Step outside immediately with your hands visible." Silence. The deputy waited, the wind whistling a desolate tune. He repeated the demand, louder this time. After a long minute, a low, controlled voice answered from behind the closed door. It was Agnes. "You have no jurisdiction here, deputy. We are respectable citizens. Go back to Wichita. We have a federal warrant for murder and fraud, Agnes. We know about the men you killed, and we know about the land theft. We have evidence. Open the door now." "Evidence?" Agnes's voice held a mocking quality. You have the word of a scared, lying notary who has likely already fled the territory for his own crimes, and the word of a man blinded by grief. Stevens signaled to Harkness to try the back door. The remaining deputies took up strategic positions, their rifles trained on the windows. The back door was also locked tight. Harkness returned, shaking his head. "Fortress, Stevens. These walls are thick. We'll breach the stone building first," Stevens decided. "That's where the proof is. Harkness with me. The rest of you keep the house covered." They moved swiftly to the stone outbuilding. The heavy padlock securing the door was formidable. Stevens ordered 2 deputies to cover them, while he and Harkness brought up a heavy axe from the nearby woodpile. It took several hard, coordinated blows, but the heavy wood of the door finally splintered, and the latch broke free. They kicked the door open, rifles raised, and stepped into the small, dark building. The air inside was thick, chemical, and cloyingly sweet, a horrifying cocktail of lye, rendered animal fat, and something metallic. The deputies recoiled, fighting back a wave of nausea. Stevens used a lantern to sweep the room. The concrete floor was there, just as Elias had described. The dark stain was still visible, but the most damning evidence was what sat in the center of the room. A massive iron vat resting on a brick furnace, with residual heat radiating from the bricks. The vat was almost entirely clean, but Stevens could see a thick, greasy residue coating the inner surface, along with some bone fragments too small to be identifiable. Beside the vat were several empty, labeled sacks, lye and quicklime. The evidence of the sisters' horrific process was overwhelming. "This is it," Stevens whispered, his face pale. "They destroyed the bodies right here." As Stevens was examining the vat, a sharp crack of a rifle shot erupted from the house, followed instantly by the sickening thud of a man falling. "Ambush! They're in the house!" Stevens shouted. He and Harkness scrambled back outside. Deputy Macabre lay on the ground, his rifle skittering away from his grasp, a dark stain rapidly spreading across his chest. He was hit from one of the front windows. The sisters were not running. They were entrenched and fighting. Stevens realized his tactical error. He had assumed they would surrender or flee. They were doing neither. They were defending their terrible secret with cold-blooded violence. He ordered the men to retreat behind the cover of the well and the water trough. "The house is fortified. We need to starve them out, not charge them. They'll bleed us dry." A moment later, a terrifying sound emerged from the house. Maniacal laughter. It was Ruth, the quieter sister, a high-pitched, chilling sound that echoed across the prairie. "You can't prove a thing, Marshal." Agnes's voice boomed, clear and defiant. "There are no bodies, no witnesses. You have nothing but bones and rumors. We have the evidence from this shed, Agnes. We have the possession of 4 dead men. We have the confession. You are done." Stevens shouted back, using the loud words to maintain control and intimidate the killers. The sisters, however, seemed strangely unconcerned. They continued to fire periodically, keeping the posse pinned down. Their shooting was calculated, aimed to wound and terrorize, not necessarily to kill quickly. Suddenly, a new and devastating smell wafted on the wind, smoke and burning wood. The stone outbuilding, the evidence shed, was now engulfed in flames. While Stevens and the posse were occupied with the exchange of fire, the sisters had somehow managed to set the outbuilding ablaze, likely with a pre-positioned fuse or an accelerant thrown through a hidden rear window. The plan was clear: destroy the remaining evidence. The vat, the concrete floor, the chemical residue, all of it would be consumed by the fire. "We can't let them burn it," Harkness yelled, starting to run toward the shed. "Harkness, no, it's a trap," Stevens screamed, but it was too late. As Harkness approached the shed, 2 simultaneous blasts erupted from the ground near the house, small, packed charges the sisters had buried. Not enough to destroy the building, but enough to create deafening noise and chaos. In the confusion, a new volley of fire erupted, aimed directly at the now exposed Harkness. He stumbled, hit in the arm, but managed to dive for cover. The sisters were not just killers. They were guerrilla tacticians, utilizing their knowledge of the land and their property to turn a simple arrest into a deadly siege. They had fortified their house, prepared explosives, and set a secondary fire to incinerate the physical evidence. Stevens realized they were outmatched and outgunned in a frontal assault. They were losing daylight, they had a wounded man, and the most crucial evidence, the stone outbuilding, was now a raging inferno. He made the grim decision. Fall back. Get Macabre and Harkness out of here. We need reinforcements and dynamite. We don't sacrifice any more lives for a locked door. The posse retreated, leaving the ranch to the flames and the two cold-hearted women. As they rode away, they looked back. In the deepening twilight, the O'Connell house stood dark and defiant, and over the sound of the burning shed, they heard Agnes's chilling laughter again, a sound of triumphant, unrepentant evil. The sisters had successfully repelled the law, destroyed the key evidence, and wounded the deputies. The psychological terror had escalated. The killers were now known, cornered and fighting back with brutal, calculated force. The battered posse returned to Wichita under the cover of darkness. Deputy Macabre was stabilized but severely wounded. Deputy Harkness was patched up, his arm shattered. Marshal Hanson listened to Stevens's grim report, his face a mask of cold fury. The sisters had anticipated the law's arrival and had turned their home into a deadly trap, all while destroying the central physical evidence of their crimes. "They're not women, Marshal," Stevens reported, his voice low with respect for their malice. "They're damn military strategists, traps, ambushes, psychological warfare, and the way Agnes laughed." Marshal Hanson turned to Elias, who had been listening with a sickening realization. "Mr. Thorne, you're the only one who knows the layout. The only one who got close and came back alive. We can't let them win. We need to go back, but we need a better plan. They destroyed the rendering shed, but what about the cave? Was there any chance they could have found and emptied the cave?" "No," Elias insisted. "It was completely hidden. I barely found the entrance myself. The drag mark was faint. If they had gone back for the barrels or the artifacts, the drag mark would be fresh, or they would have completely sealed the entrance. The personal artifacts, the wallets, the watch, and Silas's deed were now the unassailable central evidence. Coupled with Alistair's confession, they constituted the core of the legal case. The sisters had banked on the law needing a body or a visible crime scene. They hadn't counted on a persistent brother and a hidden evidence cache. Hanson decided on a tactical shift. Instead of a siege, he would use a psychological maneuver based on the surviving evidence. He would leverage the sisters' desire to be seen as legally legitimate and exploit their biggest fear, the public exposure of their methods. He called in the two lead deputies and Elias. "We are not going back with dynamite. We are going back with a single federal negotiator and a clear message. They have to believe that the artifacts are the key and that we have them all. We use their greed and their ego against them." The plan was simple, yet risky. Marshal Hanson would ride out alone under a white flag and demand a face-to-face meeting. He would offer them a conditional surrender based entirely on the threat of exposing the truth about the missing bodies. Before the marshal left, Elias handed him the small, river-worn stone he had pocketed from the shallow well site on Silas's claim back in Chapter 2. "What's this, Mr. Thorne?" Hanson asked. "It's nothing, maybe. But Agnes said they corrected Silas about a spring on his land. Silas was a trained surveyor. He wouldn't mistake a dry hole for a spring. I think this stone came from somewhere deep, not the surface. They didn't just want the land, they wanted to conceal something about the land. Keep it in your pocket, Marshal. It might be the detail that breaks their composure." Marshal Hanson rode out the next morning, leaving the posse hidden miles away, ready to move in if the signal was given. He approached the O'Connell ranch alone, holding a white linen flag high. He stopped outside the main fence and shouted his purpose. This time, Ruth appeared at the door, her face pale, her expression a mix of fear and forced calm. Agnes was nowhere to be seen, suggesting she was positioned with a rifle. "I am Marshal Hanson. I am here to negotiate your surrender," Hanson stated. "We have nothing to surrender, Marshal." "You have no proof," Ruth replied, her voice trembling slightly, betraying her calm facade. Hansen walked a step closer, holding up the canvas bundle containing the evidence. "We have the signed deed for Silas Thorne's land. We have the wallets of Higgins, Hans, and Shaw. We know you kept their artifacts. We know you did this to claim their land with false papers." Ruth's eyes went wide with genuine shock. "That's impossible. We destroyed everything." "You destroyed the crime scene. You didn't destroy the trophies," Hansen countered, his voice booming with authority. "They were found. They prove your systematic operation, and you failed to destroy the witness." "Alistair is gone," Ruth spat out, "but his sworn confession is secure. And we know every detail of your scheme, including the use of industrial lye in that burned-out shed." Hansen paused, then used the small stone Elias gave him. "And we know what you were truly hiding about Silas Thorne's claim." Hansen tossed the small river stone onto the ground near Ruth's feet. "This was found at Silas's well site. It suggests that deep down there's water, a massive underground spring. You didn't just kill men for the land. You killed them to monopolize the water supply for the whole territory, a secret that makes your land worth a fortune. Agnes told Silas he was wrong about the spring, but this stone proves the opposite. You are not just killers. You are also greedy monopolists." Ruth looked at the stone, then back at Hansen. The color drained from her face. This was a truth they had tried to bury even deeper than the bodies. This was the real motive. The spring was on the acquired land, meaning their entire operation was about controlling the future of the region's water supply, a vast economic conspiracy disguised as petty frontier disputes. The sisters were planning to sell the water rights for a massive profit. "Agnes!" Ruth screamed, turning from the door. "He knows about the water. He knows everything." Hansen saw the immediate terrifying shift in the dynamics. The sisters' carefully constructed psychological armor had been pierced not by a bullet, but by a simple stone and the threat of total exposure. A moment later, the door swung open and Agnes stood there, a rifle leveled at Hansen's chest. Her eyes were blazing, no longer with cold calculation, but with a desperate, murderous rage. "You talk too much, Marshal," Agnes snarled. "The confession is worthless without the notary. The artifacts are just junk, and that stone proves nothing. But you will die right here, and your posse will never find your body." Hansen stood his ground, maintaining his composure. "You can kill me, Agnes, but the artifacts and the confession are in Wichita. And the story of the two sisters who murdered men to control the water of the Kansas territory will be in every newspaper from here to the East Coast. Your legend will be not of shrewd ranchers, but of vicious, greedy monsters." Agnes hesitated. Her reputation, the facade of normalcy, the legal legitimacy, it was her real fortress. The thought of losing it all, of being exposed as the base, greedy killers they were, was a psychological blow far worse than being wounded. Suddenly, a massive, booming explosion rocked the ground from a distance. The posse, acting on a pre-arranged signal, the single sound of a thrown stone hitting the earth near the well, had dynamited the hidden cave entrance. "That," Hansen announced calmly, "was the sound of us securing the evidence, Agnes. The barrels of lye and the rest of the artifacts are now being secured. Your proof of innocence is gone. Your crimes are all that remain." Agnes's rifle trembled. Ruth collapsed to her knees, sobbing, the silent sister completely broken. The combination of the recovered evidence, the threat of public exposure, and the final crushing blow of the cave's destruction had shattered their control. The psychological terror had finally turned inward. If you've been on the edge of your seat, following Elias Thorne's relentless pursuit and the chilling unraveling of the O'Connell sisters' dark conspiracy, don't miss a single moment of the final chapters. Hit the subscribe button right now and join us for the final dramatic conclusion. The explosion that sealed the cave and secured the remaining evidence was the final devastating blow to the O'Connell sisters' composure. Ruth, the quieter of the two, was already on the ground, weeping uncontrollably, the carefully maintained facade of the stoic frontier woman completely gone. Agnes, however, still stood, her rifle steady, but her eyes darted frantically between the distant plume of dust rising from the cave site and the calm, unyielding figure of Marshal Hansen. Her rage had curdled into a desperate, cornered fear. "You planted that evidence!" Agnes screamed, her voice cracking with the strain of her desperation. "That stone means nothing. The water, the spring is still ours." "The spring is on the land stolen from Silas Thorne, Agnes," Hansen corrected her, his voice retaining its steady authority. "And we now have the documents and the artifacts to prove you killed 4 men for that land. Your reputation is ruined, your property is forfeit, and the people of the territory will know you as the most ruthless killers in the West." He took a careful step backward, allowing her space, utilizing the psychological pressure. "You have lost, Agnes. The law will prevail. Surrender now, and you can spare yourself the indignity of being dragged out of this place by force." Agnes's grip on the rifle tightened, her knuckles white. She had spent 5 years creating an image of respectability, using legal loopholes to mask her monstrous crimes. The collapse of that entire structure, the exposure of the scheme, the discovery of the trophies, the loss of the water rights, was a profound psychological defeat. It was not the threat of hanging that broke her, but the threat of humiliation and utter failure. "Ruth, get up. We fight them. We kill them all," Agnes shouted at her sister, trying to reignite the murderous partnership. Ruth only shook her head, her sobs turning into ragged breaths. "No, Agnes, it's over. They know about the smell, they know about the fire, they know what we did to the notary. We can't clean this up." The mention of the notary, Mr. Alistair, was a critical admission. Marshal Hansen seized on it immediately. "Where is Mr. Alistair, Ruth? Tell us where you put the notary. We need to know." Ruth looked up, her face tear-streaked and vacant. "He wouldn't cooperate. Agnes made it clean. Very clean." She pointed a shaky finger toward the back of the house, toward the well. "He's at the bottom of the well. We cleaned up the whole office, Agnes and I. We used lye. No blood. He's just heavy. The well." The depth of their methodical brutality was astounding. They hadn't fled the notary's body. They had simply disposed of it in a private water source, knowing the dark, confined space would keep the evidence hidden for years, and the water would dilute any chemical traces. The psychological implication was chilling. They had been drinking and using water from a well that contained the body of a man they had murdered. Agnes lunged at her sister, but Ruth scrambled away, her fear of Agnes now greater than her fear of the marshal. "Shut up, you fool. You're saying too much," Agnes screamed, momentarily distracted from the marshal. This was the opening Hansen needed. He raised his shotgun and fired not at Agnes, but into the air. The loud blast was the prearranged signal. Seconds later, the hidden posse, Deputy Stevens and the 3 trackers, erupted from their concealed positions surrounding the ranch house. The sight of armed, determined men closing in on all sides was the final physical barrier to their freedom. Agnes, facing 5 rifles and a shotgun, finally dropped her weapon. It clattered loudly on the dirt, a sound of absolute defeat. She didn't look at Ruth. She only stared blankly at the posse, her face frozen in a terrifying mask of fury and humiliation. The arrest was swift and brutal. The sisters, separated immediately, were shackled and searched. They offered no physical resistance once their psychological and military defenses were breached. Deputy Stevens, grim-faced, immediately secured a rope and lantern to investigate the well. The sight confirmed Ruth's confession. Mr. Alistair, heavy and still, was retrieved from the dark water, the final, crucial body, providing concrete proof of the sisters' methodical and ruthless process. Elias Thorne, who had been riding with the posse to observe the final confrontation from a distance, rode up to the ranch. The sight of the 2 women, shackled and defeated, standing in the dust of their ill-gotten empire, was a strange mix of vindication and profound sadness. He had found his brother's killer, but the victory was a hollow one. He looked at Ruth, now passive and empty-eyed, and then at Agnes, whose face was still a study in defiant hatred. He walked past them and stood at the edge of his brother's claim, looking at the spot where the shallow well had been started. He remembered Silas's last letter, the excitement, the ambition, the brief dismissed mention of the odd sisters. Elias had not only found Silas's killers, he had uncovered a vast, calculated conspiracy driven by simple, terrifying human greed, the desire for vast wealth through the control of water. The sheer realism of the crime, the use of chemicals, the legal fraud, the absence of supernatural aid, made the terror all the more impactful. As the posse prepared to take the two prisoners back to Wichita, Agnes turned and locked eyes with Elias. Her face was contorted in a final venomous sneer. "You won't get rich on that water, Thorne," she spat. "It's tainted. It's cursed." Elias simply stared back, a flicker of cold resolution in his eyes. He knew the water wasn't cursed by a spirit. It was tainted by the knowledge of what had been done for it. The true curse was the memory of the 5 men who had been sacrificed for a spring. The return to Wichita was a silent, heavily guarded journey. News of the capture of the O'Connell sisters and the horrific details of their crime, the land fraud, the rendering shed, the victims' artifacts, and the notary found in the well, swept through the Kansas territory like a wildfire. This wasn't just a local murder, it was a sensational case that exposed the brutal reality of frontier ambition. The federal marshal Hansen ensured the trial was fast-tracked. The evidence was simply too strong to allow for delays or legal maneuvers. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars. 1. Physical evidence, the recovered artifacts, wallets, watch, deeds of the 4 men, Higgins, Hans, Shaw, and Silas Thorne. The body of the key witness, Mr. Alistair, recovered from the O'Connell well. The chemical evidence and the remnants of the iron vat found in the burned-out rendering shed. 2. Testimonial evidence, Elias Thorne's harrowing account of his investigation, the discovery of the hidden cave, the pursuit, and his identification of the artifacts. Deputy Stevens's testimony regarding the fortified ranch and the sisters' use of explosives and arson. 3. Documentary evidence, Mr. Alistair's sworn confession, detailing the systematic land fraud using the fake Mr. Wallace witness and the gold payments. The official land deeds proving the sisters acquired the land immediately after each man's disappearance. The most damning aspect was the psychological evidence presented by the prosecution. The meticulous, non-emotional nature of the crime, the systematic use of a chemical process to destroy the bodies, and the preservation of the victims' trophies, all pointing to a pair of serial killers operating with cold, deliberate efficiency for immense personal gain. The water rights motive, though secondary to the murder charge, established the profound depth of their greed and the scale of their ambition. The court was packed every day. The focus was on Agnes, the clear mastermind and dominant personality, and Ruth, the passive accomplice whose breakdown during the siege revealed the depth of her complicity and terror. Agnes maintained a steely silence throughout the proceedings, her eyes tracking the jury and the judge with an unnerving, hateful intensity. She offered no remorse, no defense, only a look of cold indignation. Ruth, in contrast, was a wreck. She was cross-examined for hours. Initially, she stuck to the defense's feeble argument that the missing men were simply transients who had left voluntarily, but under the relentless pressure of the prosecution's detailed evidence, she cracked. "We didn't mean to kill them," Ruth cried out during one session. "It was only supposed to be intimidation." But Higgins fought back. He broke Agnes's nose. She had to stop him. After that, it was easier. The land was so fertile. And Silas Thorne, he kept talking about the spring. He was going to ruin everything. This confession confirmed Elias's theory and the prosecution's central narrative. The murders were initiated out of necessity, then continued out of greed and opportunity, with the ultimate goal being the monopolization of the water supply. Ruth detailed how they would lure the men to the isolated stone shed, often under the pretense of a social visit or a land negotiation. and how Agnes, with her superior strength and ruthlessness, would execute the victims while Ruth prepared the chemicals for the grisly disposal process. The defense attorney, a weary public defender, attempted to argue that Ruth was coerced by Agnes and that the artifacts were circumstantial. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Ruth's own testimony about Alistair's death sealed their fate. Elias Thorne took the stand and delivered the most powerful testimony. He spoke not just of his brother, but of the palpable fear that had gripped Elk Creek, the way the sisters' quiet malice had corrupted the law, Alistair, and silenced the neighbors. He described the moment of discovery in the hidden cave, holding up Silas's deed and the faded family portrait found in his wallet. This testimony transformed the legal case into a powerful human drama, forcing the jury to confront the emotional weight of the sisters' crimes. After only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree on all 5 counts including Alistair, and grand larceny for the land fraud. The following day the judge handed down the maximum sentence. In a courtroom packed with silent, tense onlookers, he sentenced Agnes and Ruth O'Connell to death by hanging. Agnes, defiant to the end, stood erect and stared down the judge, her only visible reaction a small, tight, unblinking smile. Ruth collapsed again, having already confessed everything. The judge ordered that all of the O'Connell property, including the ranch and the land stolen from the 5 victims, be forfeited to the territory and the water rights be made public domain, fulfilling Elias's greater objective. Elias, sitting in the back of the courtroom, finally felt the profound, chilling weight of the last few weeks lift from his shoulders. His brother was avenged, the killers were brought to justice, and the resource that was the ultimate non-supernatural motive for their horror, the water, was now secured for the community. The terror of the O'Connell sisters was over. The execution of Agnes and Ruth O'Connell occurred 3 months after the trial, carried out swiftly and quietly in the confines of the Wichita County Jail. The spectacle the public craved was denied, a final, deliberate anticlimax to a case defined by its cold, mechanical efficiency. The sisters died as they lived, with chilling control, offering no final words of remorse or confession. With the killers gone, the focus shifted to the aftermath in Elk Creek and the fate of the stolen land. Marshal Hanson, fulfilling the judge's orders, oversaw the replotting of the 5 properties, now free from the O'Connells' legal claims. The most critical step was securing the water rights of the massive underground spring found beneath the consolidated O'Connell and Thorne claims. The territory immediately began work on a public well system, ensuring the water would benefit the entire settlement, turning the source of the terrible conspiracy into a foundation for future community growth. Mr. Alistair was also given a burial, attended by a small group of his former neighbors, who now understood he was a victim of the sisters' wrath, not just an accomplice in their fraud. His fate served as a chilling reminder of the sisters' ruthlessness in eliminating any threat to their control. Elias Thorne, the key figure in the unraveling of the conspiracy, stayed in the territory long enough to ensure the rightful distribution of the land. The Thorne family was compensated for the loss of Silas's life and property, but Elias chose not to take the land. Instead, he oversaw the construction of a small, simple memorial at the site of the abandoned claim near the spring. It was a single engraved stone bearing the names of Silas Thorne, Tom Higgins, Jedediah Shaw, Hans, and Mr. Alistair. It was a testament to the victims of human greed and a final, permanent marker against the sisters' attempts to erase their existence. Elias realized that the memory of his brother was not in the physical claim, but in the justice he had secured and the good that would now come from the vital, life-giving water. He had not only found his brother's killers, he had redeemed his brother's ambition and given the community a future. He packed his bags, leaving behind the dust and the ghosts of the Kansas territory. He was done with the frontier, choosing to carry with him the truth that the most terrifying evil is not supernatural, but the cold, calculating cruelty that resides in the human heart, motivated by nothing more than boundless greed. Elk Creek, however, would never truly forget the horror. The O'Connell Ranch stood vacant for years, a permanent scar on the landscape. People shunned the property, calling it the Tainted Land. The legend of the two sisters who killed men and dissolved their bodies for the control of a hidden spring became a terrifying cautionary tale. The story wasn't told as a tale of ghosts or demons, but as a visceral warning against unchecked human avarice and the seductive power of total control. The greatest terror was knowing that everything had been meticulously real. The lie, the rendering vat, the forged deeds, the sheer, ruthless logic of the murder. Even decades later, settlers would point to the abandoned ranch house and tell newcomers, that's where the O'Connell sisters lived. They didn't have magic, they didn't have spells, they just wanted all the water. And they were so cold, they destroyed everything they touched. Be careful out here. The real terror in the West walks on two legs. The tale, preserved through Elias Thorne's actions and the official records of the trial, became a crucial part of the territory's history, a true story of psychological terror, suspense, and ultimate justice, built entirely on the dark realities of human nature.